Early last week, I ambushed Susan in her office and begged her to help me figure out what to say in this introduction. Not only was she gracious enough to not call campus police and report that a clearly deranged student had accosted her, she also handed me a perfectly good introduction on a silver platter. However, for reasons that defy analysis, I decided to set that perfectly good introduction aside and go it alone. However, luckily for you, there's a great deal of overlap between what appears in that introduction and what appears on the back cover of her collection, Salt. So when you buy that collection after this reading is over, you can read all of that and more. You're welcome. I understand that the main goal of these introductions is to prime the audience for the speaker, so here goes. Susan is a gifted poet. More than that, Susan is a gifted Utah and Mormon poet. So if it is true, as Susan writes in her preface to Salt, that the art of any ethnic or religious group reveals much about what that group values, I might say that we Utahns and Mormons value fortune cookies, red cliffs, snakes, sheep, trees, horses, wild dogs, and let us not forget salt. But that would do a great disservice to one of Susan's main desires as a poet, which she describes in the same preface as, "I hope my poems create empathy for their subjects. I hope they will cause readers to participate in that most significant endeavor of literature, to grasp what it is like to be someone else, to share the pain or bafflement or elation of others." I don't think it's going too far to say that what she's describing is charity, the pure love of Christ, which I don't think I need to go very far at all to convince you is something we value. So in the end, it might be fairer to say that we value how startlingly small we appear beside even the smallest of God's creation, not to mention those red cliffs. But it is also important to note how we are simultaneously enlarged and ennobled by that experience. I don't want to take up any more of Susan's time, but before I relinquish the podium, I'd like to enlist your help. I'm hoping that she'll read my favorite poems, but in case she doesn't, I'm going to give you a few of the names that I'd really like to hear, so that if she doesn't read them by the end, you can request an encore. So remember, 3 horses, your luck is about to change, Salt Creek Canyon at midnight, husbandry, the law of salt, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to butcher this one, but when you read it, you can clarify pronunciation, the dogs of Raramuchi. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Susan Elizabeth Howe.
That was a very kind and generous introduction. Thank you very much. And I do like the quirkiness. I'd like to, also I wanted to thank everyone who is here today when we should all be outside on this beautiful fall day. And so I think it's really kind of you to come to a reading when you could be outside doing something. Thank you very much, and I'm very honored that you would come and hear me read. I'd like to begin with some new poems, and then I'll read a few of them and then go to the ones in the collection. The first poem, I read a quotation by G.K. Chesterton, and it felt like he was throwing down the gauntlet to poets. And I thought, so I'm throwing the same gauntlet to all of you poets and perhaps fiction writers and nonfiction writers too. But he says this, which is the epigraph for my poem: "The poets have been mysteriously silent on the subject of cheese." I mean, is that like, whoa? I've only been able to find 2 other poems on cheese. One is Jim Daniels' American Cheese. It's American cheese. And the other one is by James McIntyre, who is a Scot turned Canadian, and he's quoted in my poem. So here we go. And this is on cheese. "My question is why, GK, you didn't weigh in on a wheel yourself. the Cheddar Gorge magnificent behind you, a tang teaching your tongue how curds break from whey, the way words amass and hold together as time drains off and the poem feeds us, sharp, savory. Not to mention your lack of research. See James McIntyre, Scot turned Canadian, whose ode on the mammoth cheese weighing over 7,000 pounds personifies in single rhyme quatrains the great cheese as a monarch with suitors. We have seen the queen of cheese laying quietly at your ease, gently fanned by evening breeze, thy fair form no flies dare seize. I admit this is scant poetry, doggerel composed on the fly as the cheese went off to town, not to mention the misuse of lay when what the cheese did was lie. Still, won't you admit cheese as a worthy food for a poem, as well as instructive allegory on the act of composing? McIntyre sadly needed the lesson. For months the wheels brewed, cloth-covered, and mature at Cheddar in caves of stone icicles. So a poem should swirl unconscious underground to gain its particular heft and essence. Horace recommends waiting 8 years to publish. Only then the reward, stern Stiltons and blues, sticky brie with a startling slap, soft, crumbly Wensleydale swirled with cranberries. Now the next poem, I've just discovered that you can have fun with poetry. Like I was talking to, see, this is what happens when you read, you can't remember your own name. But who was I talking to yesterday? Who interviewed me? Well, at any rate, like I write a lot about the Utah landscape, and it's a pretty harsh landscape. If you make a mistake in the Utah landscape, you can die. and so my poems tend to be serious and intense, which also is a failing of my own. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, you can have fun with poetry. What a great thing. And I read a quotation by Ralph Waldo Emerson that just called up in my mind somehow like a naive student who's first encountering Emerson. And so I wrote this poem. And let me tell you, there's an act in the poem, and my roommate, when I was in college, her boyfriend actually did this. So I just want you to know that. I didn't just make it up from nothing. Okay, this is called Not Transcendental. And the quotation by Emerson is, "To be alone wilt thou begin when worlds of lovers hem thee in?" I have no idea what you're talking about, unless you mean, Ralph Waldo, a lover might build a world and trap you. My roommate's boyfriend ate a quart jar, cracked glass chunk by chunk, chewed and swallowed it. A whole fraternity saw him do this. She said there were no punctured intestines, no vomiting blood, though he's giving up God and his family, St. Bernard, to travel the world as the guy who chews glass. She cannot love him, she's decided, and I'm with her on that, however many car races and motocross events have hired him to chomp a Heinz jar for the crowd. He was not a comfortable lover, and yes, I'm sad as a squashed plum, and yes, Glass Eater was mine, the roommates made up, and yes, I begin to be alone, which is what I think you're saying, but why would you take such trouble to mangle my dinged-up heart? And as for hems, Mr. Emerson, I choose thin-rolled jersey or the blind stitch on patterned silk. This is a new poem that may undergo further change. It's called Postmodern Colorado. Explain the meaning of barn. Explain the meaning of house. Explain the disposition of bookshop, strip mall, firehouse, I ask the native in the flood zone. The barn is a thoroughfare wherein trailers roil, the houses that slide of Douglas fir. Bookshop, strip mall, firehouse prostrate themselves before the wooden Indian in front of God's country cowboy church. Niwot has turned skeptical about walls. Brick cement joists beams, all the consonants indifferent to separation. The sign says scour the sky for numbers 3 and 4, but doors 3, 4, and 5 slant into the mud, and to what pets, bicycles, vegetables, camisoles, falderall do the numbers attach? I am driving into the road in the river in the road, unmatched asphalt dominoes for giants, game over. Chug through in a dirty boat. As an oil tank swirls, leaving a wake in a lake, a bleed in the feed of the swimming cattle, the paddling dogs, the finny schools of sheep. Molder mixed with whiffs of sewage. The map names Elk Meadow, but I claim Floundering Elk Lake with island, where stands a woman on crutches in pajamas and a sweater that won't zip. Her Pekingese gets a bouffant. The helicopter gets a parking ticket. The Arabian stud gets a ride. I looked at all the stories of the Colorado floods, and all that stuff came right out of the news stories in the Colorado flood. And this poem is called, I Agree With You Entirely, Dear Creationist. But the water beetle dived below the seas for a ball of mud, but Spider-Woman took dirt and mixed it with saliva, but Izanami gave birth to fire, though she knew her genitals would burn. But ice thawed and dripped into the shape of a shaggy cow, but the father of forests, heaving with head and feet, forced heaven and earth apart. But myriad creatures shield yang in their bosoms and bear yin on their back. But the Brachiosaurus shoved many animals off the ark. But the owl and the panther stayed awake all 7 nights. But crocodiles roll their eggs in their mouths to help the babies hatch. But into the eye of the ibis, rhinoceros, human fly, the heavens send many sources of light. And this is here we go, back in my serious mode. I'm really in love with the Utah landscape. I mean, Utah is my home, and I am so pleased to live here. I would not move given the chance. I just feel so fortunate to have the opportunity to be here. And so I write a lot about what I see where I live, mostly which is down in Sanpete County and down in the Capitol Reef area in Wayne County. So this is a sort of a Capitol Reef poem. It's titled All Things. With my finger I trace spirals on a cliff face. The iris of an eye swirls into the coiled horn of the desert sheep. Are these undulant waves, winding snake, or valleys and hills? All things pass through each other. A womb in the trunk of a man, egg and bullseye, echoes, reverberations we feel as we pick our path between junipers, creosote bushes, prickly pear, path back perhaps to the artist, the woman who drew us into her vision. A breath left a millennium ago as she crushed her last pollen for yellow, paintbrush for red, swirled them into daubs of sheep fat, shaped what she needed to meet us across this sandstone, signed with her own handprint. This is, okay, of the new poems, this is the last one I'll read. I like birds, and so I look at birds, and I write about birds sometimes. This is called What is a Grackle? You've probably seen grackles, even though you didn't know it, because they hang out in parking lots. I've seen them in parking lots all the way from Los Angeles to St. George, and even in Springville in Walmart parking lot, I recently saw grackles. So, what is a grackle? A comfort common to Southwest desert parking lots, a familiar, a messenger, an overlooked angel oiled by asphalt. Consolation of the casino, supermarket spiritual guide, picking at a free today hot dog, a dropped grape or lentil. Its purple-green head iridescent, its long keel of a tail. Black birds, but not blackbirds, with their showy epaulets blood red as a war field. Grackles glint like lacquered ebony, the females Brunhildas, if by Brunhilde you mean brown-headed, not the German ready for battle. Blind to centuries of borders of battles, they waddle stiff-legged at your feet, a janitorial sweep to their tails, checking cart tires and light poles for moths, beetles, singing their 7 songs, slides, whistles, wheezes, catcalls, chirps, murmurs, clucks, to console you for your losses. Stolen cars, mortgage payments spun to mist at a roulette table, the beloved who breathed fire and scorched your wedding clothes. Folly, wreckage, trial, they mutter, down among the packs of backerboard and spackle. We've fallen from Mayan temples. In a past life, we prophesied. In a past life, we were gods. That's true. They were Mayan. The Mayans considered them gods. And I want to read one more, and then I'll go to the poems in the book. This is called Animus. Have you ever been so angry that you wanted to hurt things and people? This is my angry poem, Animus. As an earthquake clanks signs in a supermarket into each other, as floors and shelves lose it, as hot caramel syrup spills, as sticky quarts of leaking chunky monkey, as glass shard encrusted pickle and pimento tapenade mixes with olives black and green stuffed with popcorn, with Pop-Tarts, with pork and beans, as the furies splash wine into the bleed, pools of it all your aisles a gusher, as cans heave themselves at your head, tomato juice and pig's feet and vegetable beef stew. This is as watermelon bombs every spinach, kale, blueberry smoothie on the floor. This is how, as skin blotches and raspberries, this is just as blood pressure surges like soda exploding. This is just how livid you've made me. So, okay, now to the book. I appreciated the list of poems. I think I plan to read about half of them, but you never know. It all depends on time. So half of them. The collection is called Salt, so I thought I should read you a couple of salt poems. The first one is called The Law of Salt. Salt, I think, the collection has to do with the title has to do with Utah, because I kept thinking, we're named for a Great Salt Lake. I mean, they named a city after Great Salt Lake. And there is alkali all around, and salt is central. And in both here and then I went to Austria and went in a salt mine and learned a lot of things about salt. So this is a combination of salt mine and Utah salt. Always a great time in the salt mine. From God's body, sweat flowed into the seas during the 6 days he worked on the world. This was the beginning of salt. Day, of course, meant eon, and so salt sang through oceans, seeped into rock, gathered itself in veins in the body of the earth. This formed the patience of salt. Small, anonymous men burrowed below mountains seeking it, their first descent a tunnel through darkness and dripping water that bled into an underground lake. They brought down a boat to float themselves and one flickering torch across the surface, part savor, part fear. This led to the harvest of salt. More valuable than gold, it could preserve, not merely decorate, flesh. Strips of flesh cured in salt. In the retreat of a landlocked sea, the water fell into a saturated brine in which a body cannot sink. This gathered the powers of salt. A hard, slick pan left by that sea spreads for days into the west, a burning skin of salt. The wild mare and her foal skittering across the flats will be found on their sides, tongues out, hide and muscles perfect, eye sockets crusted, purified by salt. And yet the sprinkled tomato, blood in our bodies, the taste of sex, all remnants of God. We eat death as we eat salt. And because Ben told me to read Dark Canyon at Midnight, I'll read that as my second salt poem. That's not the one I was going to read, but I'll read it. 50. It's another Utah poem as well. Salt Creek Canyon, that's the canyon that goes from Nephi to Fountain Green, and that I drive it twice a week, coming up here, going home. Salt Creek Canyon at midnight. When my husband drives the dark 2 hours home, I sit beside him and throw a road into the void beyond my headlights, survey moon, taillights, road signs, stars, to lay its bed down. And I clarify dangers. Deer become roadblocks, the more solid walls of elk, rocks washing out of the washes, rig and loaded trailer about to run us down. But sometimes when Kless says, "You're tired, put your seat back," I agree to be carried, the way our Pekingese goes limp, pretending she's glad to be picked up. Shut my eyes, lie back, and sure let the car speed. The tires blink. The stars in their giant arc grind. That lion, those bears mean to do us good. Don't worry about the temper of the bull. I crack the window to the cosmic swirl. Dream we're in blackness riding. We trust that hunter with sword and club to point out the safest way home. And now I would like to, I went through my poems thinking, I'll choose a few animal poems. And it's like 80% are animal poems. There's animals in almost all of my poems. So we're going to do a brief bestiary series of animal poems, beginning with the first poem, the title of which came from, and even the information in the poem, except for my imagined information, came from an article that appeared, in the Daily Universe, which is no more daily. So it's just the universe, but it was daily then. And this was the title of the poem is the title of the article, Python Killed to Save Woman. When our pet python wrapped around me in the night, I remembered the biblical serpent out to trick, then destroy Adam and Eve. The trick, yellow jeweled skin, creamy as topaz, and 10 coiling feet of gentle disposition, according to the pet store. Never mind the urine stink, never mind the rabbits he eats, or that when it comes to manure, he piles it like a horse. I was lured by nostalgia for the lamb lying down with the lion, or the snake lying with my husband and me, not with exactly, but free to slither about our bedroom. I admit I felt something kinky about sex with an albino Burmese python in the room, so naturally God would roil me inside a giant tightening tire. But no, Lucy, short for Lucifer, was squeezing me, and as my ribs crunched, my lungs, my breath, I thought, the snake beguiled Eve and felt the pressure laid upon her. The devil, the beast, I screamed. A head glided down my back like a steam iron and started to nibble my buttocks. Bob woke up fast, but his Swiss Army knife was no match for raw hunger, jaws unhinging, and he too got enmeshed. The snake has us, I thought, until Bob grabbed his phone. Will the cops get here? Whose bones, whose flesh, whose hunger, whose God, whose muscle, whose coils, whose will, whose passion, whose death. It's left up. Well, the title tells you, Python Killed to Save Woman. But that like their pet python really wrapped itself around her and started squeezing her. How about that? Okay, the next we have is called, it's about turkeys. In Sanpete County, we raise turkeys. There are more turkeys than people in Sanpete County. And they're Norbest turkeys. They go to your Thanksgiving dinner, all of you. And they're not happy. I don't think they have very good lives. So this poem is about the turkeys. And the definition of turkey from Merriam-Webster is the title, which I bet you wouldn't know what that was if I just read it to you first. A large American gallinaceous bird. Think of the turkeys in the turkey sheds, Barbie-dumb, by which I do not mean silent. Cacophony was invented to describe their singing, cacophony which they warble daily at breakfast, 6 a.m. A turkey relishes its fellows, sits on their heads in affection or terror, the two turkey feelings, group speak blocking more complex thought, but not pleasure, corn and oats in the mash, sun at the water trough, an afternoon bath of dust. Death is a confusion, but so is the sky, which turns liquid and falls, the splash on head or wattle a great surprise. Beaks open, they peer up into wonder worth choking over. Dim in the back of the brain, they remember a stir called flight, but their breasts are too heavy, their feathers unnaturally pale and thin, accounting for the pathetic display of the males. No matter, no sex. They come from the incubator, breeding institutional. No wonder they trill down answers to questions unasked, greet guests with what sounds like the welcome, pitiful, pitiful, pitiful. And yes, our next poem is Three Horses. Now we have a horse. One day, we live in the country, and one day you get up in the morning and there's horses on your lawn. Oh, good. So I wrote two poems about it, and this is the second one. And this was instructive to me because I found that often the second poem is better than the first poem. So now I often write 2 or 3 poems about the same subject because I don't know, you get to a more artistic place in your psyche when you're not dealing closely with what happened and dealing more with the artistic arrangement of the poem. 3 horses out of their pasture, as if only thistle and burrs grew there, as if passing the gate promised meadows knee-deep with grass, as if worship meant to buck and kick, as if the 2-legged creatures crowding them were Satan's imps, as if snorts and arched back were humility, their dash for the hills a run at a pillar of fire, as if delicate legs could carry such mighty torsos. Gopher holes didn't pock foothills, barbed wire didn't gouge, scree didn't avalanche down steep slopes. As if broken legs were nothing, as if God held the door of their stable, as if they were the next gods. And now we're going on to the Dogs of Raramucci. I did plan to read that, so. This comes from, I went on a service project to the Sierra Madre Mountains, and that's where the Tarahumara Indians live, and their lives are very, very difficult, and they have dogs, and yet they don't have anything to feed the dogs, which, was very startling to me. So here's this poem, The Dogs of Raramucci. Cariña, Negro, and Lobo, the girl calls them. Quiet as spilled blood, they pass through our camp, hoping she'll drop the pail of scraps we offer for her pigs. Negro and Lobo, Spanish words everyone knows. Cariña is harder to translate, suggesting love. She shouldn't have named those dogs, Sam tells me. In northern Mexico, animals can never be pets. One night, they tear open our garbage to lick oil from tuna fish cans, cereal dust from boxes, beads of condensed milk, and Sam names them gardenia, black rat, and rat slink. Having been beaten, they do slink, rock-stunned shadows, skeletons working their way out. In these mountains, Sam says, food is for people and animals that feed people, nothing for dogs. So I feed them far from camp, burned scones, yogurt no one will eat, the waxy skin of the cheese. They fight for each scrap, gag down the chance for a longer life. Their one feast, 3 dozen leftover eggs scrambled and left on a rock, is too late for a failing lobo who shies from the tortilla I throw him, seeing me as the scorpion of his death. When he finally drops, I'll wedge his carcass between 2 rocks, a kind of grave. Send for an amaryllis to grow through the ribs, that bulb that does nothing for months, then snakes like a cobra to its full height, spreads its insistent head. Flowers red as poison trumpet from the stalk. Don't ask the source of our velvet excess, they proclaim in 4 directions. There is more than enough. Believe it. And after the dogs, well, there's one where I wanted to read. It's about pinyon jays. One day we had a big bird feeder at our cabin, and 70 pinyon jays showed up and they pushed the lid off, and then they just started all taking turns coming down and eating at the feeder, and then go back into the hills and then let new birds come down. And it was like a phenomenal thing, and I didn't even know what they were, so I looked them up. And the bird watching book, the bird book, it wasn't the Bird Watcher's Guide, which I say it was here, but it called them dull blue crows, which I found, I was so annoyed. They're not. So the title of the poem is Dull Blue Crows. What pinyon jays look like, according to the Bird Watcher's Guide. But I say the ornithologist who called them low achievers at the back of the Aves class showed a lack of attention to the birds, diminishing powdery blue to the color of his own sadness. And no bigger than a robin, as if a robin could cheer him up. Its song and rufous feathers the gauge of all birdness. Maybe he logged too much field time watching crows eat carrion, steal babies from meadowlark nests. Maybe his wife, meanwhile, fell for a herpetologist and left for Chicago, and he began to see in every species crow. The 10, then 30, then 70 pinyon jays that appeared at our feeder were sky blue travelers in gray cloaks, a little like the Amish, smart enough to lift the lid and generous to their fellows, each filling its craw and flying to the trees so others could seize a winter stash. Then they ranged on across the hills, committed to the pine seed harvest, neither dull, nor dull blue, nor dull blue crows. Bird Watcher's Guide writer, you can get over this sadness if you visit the jays long enough before the next edition to see them rise and fall over you in a moving net of neighborliness. You might describe their faithfulness to their mates, their shared tasks, their murmuration of forgiveness. I would like to read, I'm getting close to the end. But I'd like to read a couple of poems that, I could only read at this audience because they're Mormon poems. So I'm taking this opportunity to read them to you. The first one is called Blessing the Baby, and it's about blessing my brother's last little child. And you know the difference between high church and low church? High church is high liturgy, very formal. They have a hired choir. They do ritual. And low church is when we just all come into the meeting house and we teach each other and we sing our songs, and we don't have a lot of art and we don't have a liturgy. So that's an important distinction to know at the beginning of this poem. Blessing the Baby. We are low church, a plain chapel, unadorned pews and pulpit, Dahlias on the organ, the only image of God. Come today to give my brother's infant daughter a name and a blessing. The purpose of life, says the bishop, is to gain a tabernacle of flesh and bone, and I wonder what my grandmother imagines, having visited the great hall on Temple Square, but not the house of metaphor. He's explaining our bodies, I tell her, why we love them. But it is a tabernacle of men held by the priesthood as planets are held by the sun, who take this infant in their arms. To many, they form not a circle, but an ellipse. In the name of Jesus Christ, says my brother, and gives his baby his great-grandmother's name, Julia Brooke Howe. She sleeps through her blessing, a white bow honeyed to the crown of her head, the clouds of her dress floating over the arms of the men who hold her. The congregation, though happy for the parents, swirl in their personal orbits. A boy lifts his throbbing hand in its cast. A neighbor reads a novel hidden in a Bible. A grandmother can't remember where she is or why she's come. Two teens thumb wrestle, eyes closed. They are all of the earth, earthy. Julia, awake now, is given from the arms of her father to the arms of her mother, eyes blinking just as she dirties her diaper. She, too, belongs to this soiled earth that is sometimes washed, renewed, sweet-scented. And two more poems. They're both Utah poems, the Utah landscape, Utah home. The first is called, it's called Cobbled. And it comes from having learned by living in the rural counties of the state that almost everyone who lives there has to have 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. There's one sign that says used cars and marriage counseling, which I thought is a great combination, you know. But this poem comes out of that notion of you have to work hard to get a life, and you have to bring it together. Cobbled. Ringed by desert mountains, we live in a depression, deep and long. Jackrabbit Haven, valley so remote it feels like a road stop on the way out of the world. To keep from going, we cobble together our lives. A chicken coop out of tar paper and chain link. Build the kitchen a year before the porch. Batched, not botched. Our structures skew, but they hold. Most of us batch a living as well. Walt Hatch, rancher, lays carpet. Nights, Pig Olson guards the water lines. Mornings, he hauls turkeys to the turkey plant. Today, the sign at the pincushion becomes Nedra's sewing notions and damaged freight. That's fine. We're not sorry for ourselves. Self-pity rattles for a while, then turns on you and strikes. Wild animals tell us make do, thrive. Badgers bite and hold on. Deer run straight at barbed wire. Magpies poke bark after stick into mud until strands catch and cross, form a crazed dome strong enough to hold eggs that sway and lurch all the days they're becoming alive. And for my last poem, this is a poem dedicated to hikers and riders, which you will, all of you, it's dedicated to all of you riders out there, which you will understand at the end, but I am not advocating riding on the rocks in Wayne County, although it might seem that I am. So think of the other meanings of the end of the poem. This is called Coxcomb Palimpsest. The coxcomb is a big rock formation that looks like a coxcomb. There you go. Take matches and a bedroll, toilet paper and extra socks. Canned stew if you aren't going hungry. Between Teasdale and Torrey, you can't miss the jagged mountain of yellow Navajo sandstone. The path into the cove runs through a creek and a thicket, so you'll have to hike. To the left, a flower field where hummingbirds jitter, here, there, nectar needy. The trail dips and rises, turns to sand. You'll walk through pinyon and juniper, ruthless twins that during drought kill their limbs to save the heart. Continue on the deer trail to the cliff wall where Anasazi elders painted great elk, headless, each hunter's worship a plea or thanks. Follow the cliff to the left into the deep wash. A mile in, Spanish explorers scratched their hopes. Luis Velázquez, Diego Hinojado, dry wanderers dizzy for gold they didn't find, though the mountain drew them like a pile of spilled ingots. Climb the old wagon track, look back. You'll see where pioneers got their names for the mountain, a rooster's fleshly glory. Just as the sky blazes, you'll come to Telegraph Wall and its messages from the dead. M. Larson, 1888, will invite you to his side to feel the sun gone down radiate off the cliff. Later, Mrs. Whitcomb will ward off his chill, nestling as she does. Make camp, start a fire, sit with James A. Allerton, Quinby, and Sam Gifford while your stew heats. As night comes on, settle, watch sparks crack and flick into the slow drift of the stars as they invite you, sparks, stars, to etch in your passage. Thank you. Are there questions? So, are there questions? Does anybody have questions? No questions. There aren't any questions. Oh, yes.
Were you born and raised in Utah then? Spent your whole life?
Born and raised, then I moved to Dallas, Texas for 3 years. Then I came back to Utah. Then I moved to Boston for 6 years. Then I moved to Denver. Then I moved to San Francisco. Then I moved back to Denver. Then I came back to Utah. And I've been in Utah ever since.
So, as my sister-in-law, I enjoyed you immensely, but from now on, I'm going to be very cautious because our conversation must bore you.
Well, no, that's not at all true. And what I thought you said is I'm going to be very cautious because what I say might show up in a poem. Because it might. So that's the only thing to worry about.
But you're happy having normal conversations with people who aren't poets.
Yes. Yes. I mean, if paying attention is what poetry is all about, and there's real extraordinary depth in everyone, and stories and language and all the things that go to make up poetry. And I love, you know, like I think you can see that all the poems, many of the poems come out of experience. So I'm happy and thrilled to be part of the experience of my life, yeah, with the people and the places. And Roger.
The killing python story, and I wondered whether you considered when you initially encountered the headline, the pun in killed, whether it's the participle or the past tense active verb python killed. Do you go into the newspaper and into conversations looking for puns and opportunities to take a less expected path for a story?
You know, that's interesting. Like, first there's the initial impetus in my way of writing, the initial impetus of something that seizes my imagination, that I go, but I don't know where it's ever going to go. And the path through generally comes out of engagement with language. And sometimes the poem goes, I mean, almost always I have no idea where the poem is going to go where I start it, and I just started thinking of language. And all of those matters, the puns and everything else, they're not my initial impetus. Like, I'm not a language poet primarily. I don't start with language, I start with experience. But the language comes through engagement in some way with, with the experience and trying to generate language around the experience. And I'm surprised sometimes by where the poems go and what they do. So I do try to pay attention to language, but it isn't, like, of course, that's what poetry is, so wedded to caring about language and trying to work with it, that of course I'm really engaged with it, but I begin with some sort of experience of mine or someone else's, or a question or something that is just imaginatively alive to me, like that I can work over for a while. Okay, one more question. Is there another one? Yes, Matt.
You didn't grow up in the country though, right? Is this kind of an exodus since?
No, actually, I grew up in the country. We had an acre. We had fruit trees and cows and pigs and pigeons, and so like, no, in northern Utah County, pretty close to where the Timpanogos Temple is now, but at the time was entirely rural. It was farms and dairy farms and, just open land. So, well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I've had a great time. Thank you for your questions, and we'll see you next week. The next one.